Yeah, I mean, I think coca is another example of yeah, shall I talk this? The coca leaf is another. Oh, shall I get this on? Is another example of how showing the mistakes of the conventions as the way the legal framework that now reigns drug control in the world is not evidence-based and has no cultural sensitivity at all by not making this distinction between the leaf and the derivative. It's a clear so whatever change that should happen, we are actively advising the Bolivian government on how to proceed to request the removal of the coca leaf from the schedules. We think that there's a good reason to do that and to repair this mistake. And in terms of a framework, because the main reason now, not so much the older arguments that have been used about that coca leaf consumption would lead to malnourishment or moral decay, which was the original reason it was included in the conventions. But now the main argument is the extraction of cocaine. So any legal framework that would be that we would promote to do is having some kind of control over wholesale coca and having a licensing system or some kind of system that would allow the authorities and the health authorities to monitor the whereabouts of big quantities, because you really need a big quantity of coca leaves to get an efficient cocaine production. People buying tea and wrapping up bags, that's simply just not a realistic scenario. But I think, as Axel also said, there should be much more flexibility in the framework based on these scientific evidence and on cultural sensitivity, and particularly for coca. That's a very urgent question.
Could you just finally maybe preempt the question? If you have coca like this, is this easily turned into cocaine? In other words, if this is legally on sale, can people then just start producing their own cocaine?
Well, I mean, it has cocaine, so it can be done. There's no reason to ignore it, but you would need not just a sufficient ready supply of fresh leaves and a whole array of chemical products that are not exactly household staples. They're not easy to get to process coca, and we've done some calculations on the price of what tea would cost and what these products would be marketed for, and the cost for the chemicals and the processing and the labor and everything, and we reached a price much higher than the current cocaine price on the street. So the question would be if that is really worthwhile, the maintenance of this current system of control of the leaf. You could also argue that having mild stimulants at hand, less people would recur to cocaine, because this is a milder form and a very unrisky, not risky kind of cocaine use, if you want. But in a very low doses. So I mean, you could also argue this could replace the demand in the market for mild stimulants and have people away from cocaine. That's another argument. Yeah.
Thanks very much. Well, I'd like to open up to questions now. As I said, either about the thoughts that this sparks about the nature of regulation and potent substances in cultures, or more specific questions from either Axel or Pien. So Michael, you had a hand up.
Yeah, just to follow up on your comments, we live in societies which in essence thrive and are based on risk-benefit assessments. And I guess the big challenge for both substances really is how do they fit in there? If I were to put on a hat as a regulator and say I'm a regulator, which I'm not, I would say, well, there's no benefit, but there are risks. Axel made some reference to it, and I actually think the risks associated with hygiene, with other forms of contamination, could be pretty high. So how do we deal with this on the basis of being driven by risk-benefit assessments?
Okay, I think it's interesting, and I think the assumption or the presumption of drug policy discussion, the discourse, is always that it's scientifically assessed. And I think the scientific assessment is fairly straightforward. We're looking at the sort of medical implications, and in the case of most substances, as long as they are regulated, the risks are quite manageable. Once we control them, so to speak, the risks become very difficult to calculate and assess and very often increase. Much more important, however, I think, is the risk assessment of changing drug policy. Because at the moment, drug policy moves like a supertanker. It just carries on its own course, because getting a majority at ECOSOC, which is the particular body at the United Nations that discusses drug conventions and drugs policy, to get a majority for any kind of change is impossible, because you've got these various alliances of different states. Also, you've got vested interests within countries, but also within international agencies that are quite happy to carry on with a system that really isn't working anywhere particularly well, but it becomes too difficult to fix, and we do not know what lies afterwards. And then, of course, you have to also make the risk assessment. If you do, let's say, if you were to move from a non-regulated criminal market that we have at the moment towards a regulated legal market, you are left with agencies, you're left with law enforcement agents that are now unemployed, that have contacts in low places, that there's a real risk factor here. How do you assess the risk? What kind of process do you put into place to avoid the problems that are associated with that? I don't know whether that answers your question, but